G'day, Sid here from Sid's Sharpening Service, Bridgetown. Sharpening knives, scissors, tools, planer blades, even chainsaws. Not hand saws and not circular saws. There are several questions that I get asked time and time again. How did you get into sharpening stuff? What equipment do you use and how do you do it? Can I do it myself, and what equipment would I need? Would I need a stone, a steel, one of these handheld ceramic sharpening things? Are they any good, or do they just wreck your blades? And all of that said, how do I stop my knives going blunt too quickly in the first place? I'm going to answer those questions for you now. How did I get into sharpening? Well, I got my first pocket knife when I was, 8 or 9 years old, and I had to learn to sharpen it. I've been sharpening knives ever since. I joined a fishing club back in the 70s, 80s and 90s, and my knives always seemed to be sharper than everybody else's, so guess who got to sharpen everybody else's knives? Over the decades, of course, I've been doing our own knives in the kitchen, and I suppose about 10 years ago my hands started to play up on me, a bit of arthritis and all that, so I thought instead of doing it on the oil stone, which I had done for the previous 50 years, I would move to a machine. And this is the machine I use. This particular machine is not all that expensive, but it is what's known as a whetstone grinder. You can spell it W-E-T or W-H-E-T. Look it up, suit yourself. But it is a low-speed, water-cooled whetstone grinder. A nice 50mm or 2-inch wide wheel, which is important. Low speed and water cooled. Why all that? Well, when you sharpen a knife on a normal bench grinder, or I've seen knife sharpening professionals using these belt sanders, and there are sparks flying off that knife onto the floor. If there are sparks flying onto the floor, that means there are red hot little bits of metal flying off, and therefore the edge of the knife remaining is also red hot until it cools down, and that means that the steel in the knife edge has lost its temper. Not as in, but no, when you temper steel it makes it tougher. And so it will still remain reasonably hard, it will still cut nicely to start with, but it's not as tough and it won't last nearly as long as a properly sharpened knife which is kept cool. So that's what the low speed is all about, and that's what the water bath is for, that the wheel passes through. Right, that's the equipment. When I get a knife to sharpen, the first thing I do is look at it very carefully. What sort of condition is it in? If it's one that I've been sharpening on a regular basis, the chances are it's in pretty good condition, and all I need to do is touch it up. On the other hand, if it's really stuffed and really blunt and it's been abused and hasn't been sharpened in its life, then it'll take far, far too long to try and sharpen on a normal fine grit stone like this. So that is where I use this baby. It's not a diamond wheel, it's a CBN wheel. CBN is cubic boron nitride, the second hardest substance on the planet known to man. The reason we use these rather than diamond is because CBN, whilst being nearly as hard as diamond, it is also tougher. And the little fragments, the particles, the abrasive particles on the wheel won't crack and break and fly off as readily as they do with a diamond wheel. But it's still nearly as expensive as diamond. Yeah, about $500 for a wheel like this. Ouch! With that wheel, which is the CBN wheel, which is a coarse grit, I can rip off quite a lot of metal in a hurry and re-shoulder the knife. Get it in the right shape before I then transfer to the fine grit wheel and do the final sharpening on the edge that actually does the cutting. The actual sharpening process, I could do it freehand, but you get a much more consistent and accurate result if you first of all place your knife in a jig. There we go. Once it's in that jig, you're then all set, almost all set, to get a very consistent and accurate result. But before you actually start sharpening, you need to test the angle, either by checking against the existing shoulder. And I use a couple of little chemi pen marks on the shoulder so that when I do a test I can see that those marks are evenly and completely obliterated, Or if I'm starting from afresh, I can set the angle with my angle gauge. Once I'm happy with the angle, then I can start to sharpen. The actual method is quite simple, at least it appears that way. All I do is turn it on and then pass the knife backwards and forwards. I'll show you. That's it. And I'll do that a number of times on each side until I'm happy that the knife is sharp. More on that later. But the actual technique, I know it looks easy, but there's a lot of experience and practice goes into it. I don't just stand here like this and do it. I'm actually like this. If you watch Dancing with the Stars, the judges there say, you need to get a good frame, darling. Well, it's true. I have to be set in a nice, consistent fashion to get that even action. So I'm not dancing with the stars, I'm jigging with the knives. Whew. That's pretty deep, isn't it? Okay, now, as I'm sharpening, I'm using 3 of my 5 senses. I can see what's going on. I see the water flowing over the edge, and I get to know, just by the look of that water, when the edge is getting sharp. Also, I can listen to it. When it stops making a fairly rough sound and becomes a nice fine hissing sound, a bit like steaming milk in a coffee situation, then I know it's getting sharp. And finally, the feel. Initially it might just feel like it's sort of bouncing off the wheel, but once it gets very sharp, it starts to get a bite to it. Just as it contacts the wheel, you can feel it biting in. So once I reckon that all those sensors are satisfied, then I can use my vision once again. If it's still not quite sharp, you can see a thin silver line down the edge, more work required. Can I shave with it? I can tell you I haven't got too many hairs left on the back of my left hand. Does it catch in my nail like it should when it's a really sharp edge? Otherwise it'll just slide off and it means it's blunt still. What about the good old paper test? Eh? Oh, hang on. Isn't there a story that you don't cut paper with knives or scissors? That blunts your knife. I can tell you that cutting anything with your knife is going to blunt it eventually. Paper, food, meat, doesn't matter. Cutting paper doesn't blunt your knife any faster than cutting anything else. That's still not the final part of the equation. Even though it's now sharp enough to shave with, I want to get it even sharper. And that means giving it a final polish, sharpening polish, on this wheel over here. It's leather and it's impregnated with a cutting compound, very fine cutting compound. So now, judging the angle manually this time, just pass it backwards and forwards a few times, and that gives it the final sharpen and removes any burr that might be there. Okay, what about sharpening yourself? Can you do it? Sure, you can. What do you need? Aha. Well, if you're going to do it without buying a machine like this, you still need something with a broad surface to contact the knife. That means you can't get any nasty little jagged edges or marks or nicks in your knife. So that's where your good old oilstone comes in. These are two-sided, coarse and not so coarse. Right, so you start on the coarse side if you've got a bit of metal to remove, and then finish on the fine side. The technique is easy enough. The trick is getting the right angle. If you're too shallow, it's not a problem. You can't do any damage. If you're too steep, you will blunt the edge. So trial and error. If you've got an existing knife with a good shoulder on it, which all feels about right, put those little chemi pen marks on it, and then just test the angle. You can do it away from you or towards you. I prefer just to drag it back towards me. Gives me the most consistent results. And then just keep doing it until you're happy with the knife's sharpness. And as it's a nice broad surface, as I say, there's no single point of contact. Those little ceramic wheel sharpeners that you pull the knife through, that's a single point of contact with a very nasty little ceramic grinding thing that can leave you with a rather jagged edge. Some of the knives I received to sharpen my clients have been using those things, and the edges are pretty much wrecked. They're okay if you know what you're doing and you have a very smooth, precise action. But I still recommend the stone. Oil stone or water stone, it doesn't matter. Why do you use oil on an oil stone? That's because all the little particles that come off the stone and the little bits that come off the knife, the slurry and the swarf, if you want to get technical, get carried away in the oil, and it just lubricates a little bit, makes it for easier sharpening. What about steels? This is a steel. This is actually not your traditional steel. There are two sorts. There's the steel which has just a steel rod with the flutes in it, and that's designed, or supposed to reform the edge on a knife that's got slightly out of form. Look, I don't know about that. I've never had much joy with those things. I go for these. This is a diamond honer. It actually takes a little bit of metal off the edge. And once again, you've got to make sure you get that edge angle right. Too shallow, and you won't do any harm. Too steep, and you'll bugger the knife. So once again, practice. And you don't need to do it like the butcher, you know, this fast, fancy stuff. Slowly and carefully. And you'll get really good results with that. Be prepared to pay a bit, maybe $100 for something like this for a good one. Now, there's something else for keeping your knives sharp, or more accurately, not getting them blunt too quickly. The most common reason that a knife in the kitchen goes blunt is because you're trying to cut your chopping board in half. Yep, you go through that tomato and then across the board. That's blunting your knife. The chopping board itself plays a big part. Your normal wooden boards are the best, except end grain bamboo. They are not very good for your knives, apparently. What's the worst sort of board you can use? A tempered glass board. They are dreadful. If you've got one of those, throw it away. Just get yourself a normal, some of the polyurethane or polyethylene, whatever they are, some of those boards are okay, but just get yourself a good old wooden cutting board. That's probably the safest option. And then there's the actual technique of cutting the food. I'm not a chef in a restaurant, so I'm not in a hurry. I don't have to do everything very fast. So whereas a chef cutting a tomato, get that nice rocking action going, get it going very fast, I will cut through the tomato until the knife hits the board, but then I won't blunt the knife by moving a knife across the board. I'll move the tomato along the knife. And it takes about 3 times as long, but because I'm only doing little bits at a time, it doesn't matter, and the knife stays razor sharp. What is actually happening when you cut? Well, if you look at a finely polished, honed edge under a microscope, you'll see that it's not so smooth after all. It's a series of microscopic little jagged serrations or teeth, abnormalities, just because of the nature of the process and the steel itself. So what happens? Okay, when you cut food, you are rupturing or breaking the fibres of the food by stretching and deforming them past the limit that they hold. When you chop down, you are deforming the food fibres like that until they break. When you slice, all these little serrations have friction with the tomato food fibres, and they catch them and drag them sideways. It's a much more violent, localised action. And that's about it. Thanks for watching.